as well as actually getting the sort of content right of your application, it's also important to write well and get across the things that you need to get across in a simple and clear way that reviewers will understand and appreciate. So this session is really about sort of pitching your application. The talk has been taken from a longer talk that we give at the Essential Guide to Grant Applications, and a really useful reference there is the Research Funding Toolkit. And whilst this is more about, I suppose it's the Essential Guide to Grant Applications covers sort of the content of specific grant applications as well, so your stats, health, economics sections, etc. There's a sort of general stuff around, you know, it doesn't have to be about a project specifically. It's also about how you pitch yourself as a person, or how you pitch your you know, your training and development package. I mean, obviously the host organization will be a letter that someone else has written, but actually learning how to pitch as you've learned that lesson is also that section is also quite important. This is a book that we refer to in our Essential Guide to Grant Applications. It's quite handy. It gives you all sorts of revelations about how to write, which is really useful. So we'll be talking about some of those. In the book, they talk about 4 key propositions when you're writing a grant application. Firstly, the importance, that the project is important. So in the case of a fellowship that involves a project, then obviously you do have to get across the project's importance. But in the other sections, if you're talking about a fellowship that's just about training or development, it's obviously the importance of that training and development and how that relates to your future aspirations and your future project. So just a quote from a few chair's reports. You need to demonstrate that what you're doing is important. Why should the NIHR invest in your work? What difference will it make? Make clear that your proposed research is applicable on a national level. So these are the sorts of things that chairs have said about applications they've seen in the past. The second proposition is the success proposition. So basically this project can answer the question, or in relation to a training fellowship, that the training plan will deliver the sorts of training that you need. So if we just look at the quote there, this is for a doctoral application. One of the joys of being involved in the doctoral fellowship selection committee is the wow factor for an applicant who has everything lined up, and you just know that they're going to make a difference. So you've got a project that is answering an important question. It really will work. You've got a training package that's really well written and will support you in doing that work, etc. The value proposition is this project is good value for money. And at the end of the day, that's something that people will take into account. These fellowship applications are pretty flexible, and obviously they cater for people with different forms of employment and on different career paths, which have different salary scales. So they do cover, you know, quite a large range, and we have seen projects, you know, towards £1 million, etc. You know, if there's good justification for that work, but at the same time, you will be being judged against other projects. And some may be viewed as better value for money at the end of the day. So it is something to bear in mind with grant applications generally. And finally, the competence proposition. So this team or this person can deliver. So good research comes out of high quality institutions and groups. You need to align yourself with the best of the best. And that's all about getting your host institution and your supervision in place and making sure that it's appropriate and it's high quality. So everything in a way that you write in a grant application will support one or other of these propositions. So your fellowship application is basically a sales pitch, and although it's not nice to think about it like that, it is in fact that. It is a competitive application, and it's got to read well if people are going to be investing in you at the end of the day. So it's a sales pitch aimed at convincing the NIHR that firstly your idea is important enough, that your project is feasible. Obviously those are referring to fellowships that have a project. You and your supervisory team are good enough, your host institution is suitable, your training package is appropriate, and as a package you will successfully deliver something meaningful to the NIHR. And if it's for another funder, obviously you'll be making sure that you're doing something that they are interested in and it's within their remit. and that what they will get will be good value for money. And obviously, you have to convey that. You have to convey that in writing. Just a reminder again of the assessment criteria, always bear those in mind and make sure that you address them in your application. So what do you need? What do you need if you're putting in a fellowship application? Well, firstly, you need a good story. And we've talked a bit about this in the narrative CV. And basically, that story can relate to you, or that story can relate to your project. In fact, it can relate to both if it's a fellowship that has both of those components. So you're creating a story that people can understand and relate to and see the rationale of what you're doing. So basically, you're presenting an argument for the work in the background and rationale. And as Dean said, it's not a sort of rambling literature review. So if this is for a project, you'd be saying, why the work is important, what work has supported that, why that work is deficient in some way, what innovation have you got, and why is it a good next step, and some basic information about why that might be a good next step. So those are the sorts of things you want to bear in mind. So if we look at a definition of an argument, it's a coherent series of reasons, statements, or facts intended to support or establish a point of view. So that background section in a project related part of your proposal is going to be really quite pointed and argued. And in your narrative CV, you're going to be thinking about how you can tell a good story about yourself, and why people should support you. And you can use things called convincing and defensive elements. This is especially in relation, I think, to the project justification. Convincing elements are the sorts of things that are like saying, this is a major problem. Prior work is deficient in these following ways. And defensive elements might be where, there might be, there's no one brilliant design that will cover all eventualities in a project, and there will always be caveats. So these defensive arguments are kind of caveats, but at the same time, you should be providing mitigation. Now, the convincing arguments are designed to stay in the head of the reviewer, and they will remember those. The defensive arguments are designed to allow a reviewer to forget about something because you've dealt with it. It's something they might have a problem. They might bubble in their head saying, oh, hang on a minute, I'm not sure that design is suitable. But then you go on to say, well, I'm using this design because, and it's the best design because, so you've mitigated it, and they can forget that as a niggle, and it won't be there when they're sitting on the panel talking about your project and discussing it and thinking about whether or not to fund it. The second thing you need is about style. So this is all about how you go about writing. This is just, again, a quote from one of the chairs of the NIHR Doctoral Fellowship Committee. The first cut in the applications process is made by the selection committee. Your application needs to be pitched so the informed non-expert can understand it. If you cannot communicate the importance of what you want to do, or you write in a highly specialized language that few people can understand, the application is unlikely to succeed. I cannot emphasize this enough. Now, this is an NIHR panel. If you're applying for MRC, you may find that they do actually have specific boards, so they're likely to have people on those boards who have perhaps a bit more subject knowledge. But you can bet that even in those sorts of boards, there won't be people who understand the highly technical, sometimes highly technical area that you might be working in. And in NIHR, their fellowship panels are quite generic, and whilst they do split into broad subject areas. So we have the sort of public, local authority, public health, social care. We have the clinical practitioner academic, and we have the medical dentistry type boards or committees. Basically, you are presenting to a panel essentially who are methodologists. There will be PPI members, there will be non-experts. So if you're talking about, I don't know, MRI and using all sorts of MRI terms, you need to explain them. So if you think about different aspects of style, you need to position your key messages carefully, and this is all about writing. Usually that means if it's important, it will go at the start of the paragraph rather than at the end, which we quite often do in academic writing. Consciously use writing techniques, as I say, assert, justify, which is the one I've just described, priming, signposting, linking, tag phrases. If you come to our Central Guides grant application, we go into more detail about these, but priming is basically letting a reviewer know in the way that you're writing something else is coming up. It may be priming them about the project. So, you know, this disease is this prevalent, it's causing this much cost to the NHS. It's priming people to see something that will address that problem. Signposting is basically helping the reviewer work their way around an application, allowing the speed readers who perhaps look more superficially at an application to skip sections if they're not relevant to them, but the detailed readers for those particular areas can dive in and look at all the detailed readers. So for example, if your application goes out to peer review, you will get a subject specialist looking at it, and they will be interested in those detailed areas. Linking is just a way of writing, so you're using however and importantly, things like that. Tag phrases are phrases that we use throughout that might have a technical meaning, but actually you explain them at the start and you use them consistently throughout, which means the reviewer gets used to using them and understanding them themselves. You can repeat key messages. We're often think it's important not to repeat ourselves too much, but in fact, whilst your fellowship application will be well read overall, there will be some reviewers who don't read all of it. So if there's something important you want to get across, it's important to flag it up in more than one area of your application. Keep it memorable. So, you know, I think there's some psychology behind this, but, you know, don't give them too many bullet points at once. You know, you have so many, I think it's about 7 that you can actually remember, maybe less than that. But, you know, keep it memorable. Make it an easy read, so don't overdo typography. People are very tempted to put sort of emboldened words in the middle of paragraphs. Actually, for speed readers, that's really annoying. You need to use short sentences, short paragraphs, and simple punctuation. As I say, if something's important, it goes at the beginning of the paragraph. Use adjectives and adverbs sparingly. You can save that for your fictional writing, which you're no doubt doing on the side. Headline messages, not convoluted arguments. So again, getting those important messages across in short sentences. You can use the present tense. That actually cuts down on the dreaded word count. And we all know how we struggle with word counts. Have breathing space and use subheadings. So if you have very crowded small font writing, and often actually NIHR will specify what font size they want to see, it's awful to read, you know, and some reviewers might just take one look at it and think, oh no. So if you use subheadings and space out your paragraphs, it's a much easier read. And I think the NIHR shifted away. They used to actually provide you with specific headings that they wanted, for example, in the background section. But there's they've sort of implied that they still want those things, but they haven't necessarily said you need a heading. So you can put some other subheadings in there too, which help guide the reader around. And in fact, you can use some of those assert, justify sentences. So, you know, TIA is an important problem. You can actually have it as a subheading, and then any reviewer will pick that up very quickly. Avoid acronyms and buzzwords. If you have to use them, and we do work in technical areas, a lot of us, then do explain it. And if you are using acronyms that you have explained, make sure you do repeat the explanation of them more than once in the application, because if you've got a long application and a reviewer thinks, oh God, this was defined on I don't know what page, they get very annoyed because they have to then search through the application to remind themselves of what the acronym is. Be consistent. So if you're talking about obesity, don't then talk about overweight. You know, make sure you've got a definition of what you mean, and then use that term consistently throughout. Again, with fictional writing, we might think of wanting to vary, you know, the terms that we use. But in academic writing and grant applications in particular, you do not want to confuse the reviewers. So you use the same terms and you define them, and then you use them consistently throughout. Be logical. So when you're reading through your background section, or you're even describing your own story in a narrative CV, make sure that you don't have these non sequiturs, that you're not using however when it's not a however, you know, and make sure that it all hangs together in a logical way. So it's not like that famous Escher diagram with all those stairs going in funny places. It's actually very plain to see, plain and easy to see. Avoid spelling mistakes and poor grammar. I know that you know, We all make the odd spelling mistake, and there's bound to be one or two in a long document. But it just gives such a bad impression. If there are a lot of typos, people will either think it's been done in a hurry, or you know, people haven't made use of spell check or whatever, or paid enough attention to it, or read through it enough times. And you know, if you do suffer from dyslexia or issues with writing, then you know, get help with that. You know, get a colleague to read it through and point out where there may be spelling mistakes or grammar issues. And keep it reasonably formal. I think in academic writing now we accept that you and I are sort of words that we can use, but you know, don't use some of the things like isn't, and don't sort of give opinions unless they are justified. And finally, sales pitch. So interestingly, to put this together, I did have a look and see what salespeople are told to do. And these are the sorts of things that came up, and they're absolutely relevant to funding as well. So know your customer. So look at the funding scheme. Is it really covering the area that you're interested in? If you can write a brilliant grant application, but if it's not in remit for the funding committee, they won't look at it. So make sure you're checking the remit of your funder. Know your product. So what is it that you're offering them? You know, is it a development of an intervention? Is it a trial? But know what it is and how it fits in with what's gone before. Offer a solution to the problem. This is what invariably we're doing with health services related research. There's an issue, we want to solve it. So you are offering a solution to a problem. And that might be a problem related to a lack of information. So if you're doing an exploratory study, you're still addressing the problem of a lack of information. Acknowledge problems with existing products and say why yours is better. So what has gone before? So make sure you've got a thorough literature review. Ordinarily for project grants, the NIHR would like to see a systematic review. It may be one that's been published recently by somebody else and you can build on it. If you're undertaking a fellowship, sometimes that systematic review experience can be part of your fellowship application. But either way, for the application itself, you will need some sort of literature review that covers all the major, the key publications in the area. And so you need to have shown that you've looked at that and you can demonstrate that actually there's still a gap after all that, or there are deficiencies with the projects that have gone previously. Hook your customer. Now, we've had some mention of plain English. That is terribly important. And the plain English summary, in fact, in a grant application or a fellowship application is tremendously important. It's where reviewers start, and it's quite often where they'll gauge whether they've got any interest in reading it anymore. So if it really doesn't seem like an important question, or it's impossible to understand, it's not going to set you up well for the rest of the application and their experience of it. They may already be rather prejudiced against what comes next because they've just not understood it at all right at the start. Make a good first impression. So again, this good plain English summary, no typos in your name or your project title. Tell a story, as I say, whether it's a story about you in the narrative CV or whether it's a story about the project and the rationale for it in a project grant or the project bit of your fellowship. Address objections up front. So this is where I was talking about those defensive arguments. So, you know, if the study design is perhaps not typical for the sort of situation perhaps you're expecting to see a randomized control trial, but you're doing something different. A reviewer in their head will have a little bubble and it will pop up and say, why aren't they doing a trial? You need to answer that as soon as it's in the reviewer's head. So you'll say, whilst, you know, you think this a trial is a good approach in this situation, these are the reasons why we're doing something different. Differentiate yourself. I mean, obviously, research is always in the sense at the cutting edge of knowledge. You need to be doing something original and innovative, and you need to stand out so that you can compete with others. Listen and respond to the customer. So this might happen in a project grant. This would be like at a stage 2. For a fellowship application, that might be during an interview where you're listening to what the reviewers are saying or the questions that are being asked, and you are responding to them without being defensive, just being logical and saying, yeah, I hear you, and then addressing whatever it is that they've come up with. And dazzle them basically with your project and yourself, and show them that you are or are capable of being what they want you to be in those assessment criteria. Substance is obviously important, and I think probably most of the rest of the presentations today have been about substance and the things that need to be in those applications. But in relation to that, we're looking at an eligible applicant, we're looking at a good research question, a well thought through and appropriate training program, appropriate methods to answer your research question, a good host institution, a great supervisory and mentorship team, appropriate patient service user and public involvement. So basically the perfect PEEPS package. Remember to say the right things in the right way. So, I mean, it's just a little cartoon by Scott Adams, but yeah, you can be a real superstar academically, but you can still get on the wrong foot sometimes if you don't say things in the right way. Balance the logic and rigor that we all have as clinicians and academics. I think we're all a bit Dr. Spocky, or Mr. Spocky, I should say, with a touch of enthusiasm and passion. So you need a little bit of Kirk there, who's you know, got that sort of slightly passionate feeling. So if you're telling the story about yourself, you know, give them a bit of insight about, you know, why you're interested in something, what has motivated you, what interests you, what did you find exciting about a project. I, not we, and this is important for fellowship applications. Again, another chair's report quote, ownership of the project, particularly at doctoral level, wasn't always apparent. While selection committee expect that applicants will have had help and support when preparing a fellowship application, it is very important that the applicant has ownership of the research they are presenting and that this comes across in the application form and at interview. And I've seen people in the past, you know, who've kind of been sort of drafted in to do someone else's research project, and they perhaps don't have the enthusiasm they should have for it, and B, when it comes to answering questions on it, they're sometimes not terribly well versed in it because they simply haven't had the interest to submerge themselves into it. So it is important that you have ownership of the project for fellowships.